Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And as you know, our mission today is to remind ourselves how little the world seems to learn from history. And we've got the perfect guest to do that.
Louis Simons has reported on the most dramatic stories in Asia for over 30 years, from the late 60s to the late 90s. Ethnic massacres, dictators stealing massive wealth from their poor countries, America's catastrophic war in Vietnam, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the fall of Cambodia, and on.
And along the way, he won a Pulitzer Prize with some colleagues. In fact, their reporting helped topple a corrupt dictator.
Lou Simons, I have to say, you've been a friend of mine for some time, but I learned a lot about your career reading your new memoir, which is called To Tell the Truth, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. Welcome.
Thank you, Dave. Good to be here. And there's only so many war stories that one can tell a friend without reaching one's limit. So that's why you had to read the book.
And by the way, Lou, happy birthday.
Oh, thank you, Danny.
We're going to get into this all in more detail in a few minutes, but let's begin briefly in Vietnam, please. You went there in 1967, right, to cover the U.S. war in Vietnam.
Correct.
You were with the Associated Press. Before we get into your reporting there in more detail, is there a scene that still comes back, even today sometimes, pops into your mind and haunts you?
I think the one that is most troubling to me is I was out in the field with a patrol of Marines, and this is in the fall of 1967. We were on foot for 2 days, and nothing happened. They anticipated finding a major Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army unit and coming under attack, and nothing happened. So after 2 days of this, I said I would take my leave and return to Saigon. So the captain called for a helicopter that was in the area to take me out. And he happened to have a slightly injured young Marine there as well who needed to be evacuated. And all of a sudden, the medevac helicopter came under attack. A very gutsy guy, and he hovered over us. We clambered in, and we found ourselves in a helicopter that was filled with dead and dying young Marines.
Oh, my gosh.
He took off straight up. I got thrown to the front on top of all these injured Marines and dead Marines, and then the helicopter tipped upward again, and I got thrown back all the way to the end of the helicopter. And by the time this all finished, I was just completely covered with blood, all of it other men's blood. I myself was fine, but it's just something I've never really quite gotten out of my mind.
I should remind everyone that looking at the Vietnam War, even now, is like a Rorschach test, where every side sees something different. The U.S. thought it was fighting against the worldwide spread of communism, led by communist North Vietnam against South Vietnam, which was a U.S. client state. But North Vietnam saw it as an anti-colonial war of independence. That clash of perceptions cost a lot of blood.
I was stunned when I looked up these statistics just recently. The U.S., throughout the whole course of the war, sent 3 million troops in and out of Vietnam. At the peak, 500,000 troops were there. 58,000 U.S. troops were killed, and 3 million Vietnamese, North and South, died during the war, most of them civilians. The U.S. withdrew in 1973, and 2 years later, North Vietnam did, in fact, conquer the South, but it did not trigger the spread of communism around the world, as U.S. officials had always feared.
And Lou, we kept thinking, Danny and I, as we read your book, that we're still living through these failed wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, lots of deaths, but the purpose was not really achieved by the U.S. So, Lou, how did you picture the war when you went there? What were you thinking?
I mean, maybe it's worth backing up just a moment to examine very briefly why I was in Vietnam in the first place. I was not interested in going to Vietnam or going to Asia. I was not interested in anything other than going to Africa. And the AP knew that, and I was in New York on the foreign desk. I was getting prepared to go to somewhere in Africa as soon as the bureau opened.
And let me just add that you were a young guy. I mean, you were just in your mid or late 20s, right? You had recently been
I was 25 years old. That's right.
you'd recently been married, and you'd never been a foreign correspondent anywhere.
You're absolutely right. I had never been a foreign correspondent, correct, which is often the case.
Oh, it's typical, yeah. Especially Vietnam. I mean, so many reporters of our generation cycled through Vietnam.
Right.
I was there too, but it was at the end of the war, 73 to 75. So,
And you sort of had to be young and fit to do what was being asked of you. And so, as I said, I was going to go to Africa, and then it turned out I got a phone call one morning saying, we need you to go to Vietnam. We don't need you in Africa now. You want to go? And after a little agonizing, my wife and I decided we would go. And off we went.
But wait. Before you go to Vietnam, something that really hit me in your book, I love this part. You said before you officially accepted, there was an important call you had to make, not just to your wife.
Well, my parents. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah. So here I was 25 years old, married, not a kid, really, but I was an only child. And my parents, I meant everything to them. So my wife and I drove out to New Jersey, and we had dinner with my parents. And then I sprang it on them. And I said, Mom and Dad, Carol and I are going to Vietnam. And they laughed. And I said, no, we are. And they didn't exactly fall on the floor, but it was pretty close to that.
And before you go on, I just want to mention to our younger listeners that back in those days, I mean, young men in the United States, many of them were doing everything possible, including fleeing to Canada to get out of going to Vietnam because everybody knew from the news that it was a horrendous war. You know, you're in steamy jungles, people are getting blown up left and right.
yeah, there was a draft then. So,
And here you are volunteering to go to Vietnam. And as we often do here on Two Reporters, we're going to play some news clips from that era. Here's the first.
Thursday evening, the new mobilization to end the war in Vietnam began its 36-hour march against death from Arlington National Cemetery to the Capitol. In all, 45,000 would walk the 4.5-mile route, each carrying the name of a dead American serviceman.
So back to your parents'
Yeah,
house.
back to my parents' house. And I remember my mother, her face was absolutely ashen, and she turned to me and to both of us, and she said, please don't do this. If you do, it will be the end of us.
ooh, boy.
And I was so shaken by that. I said, okay, if that's what it means to you, then I'll tell AP no. And I knew that if I turned it down, my dream of being a foreign correspondent would suffer if not be ended right then and there. So we went home and had a bad night. About 7 in the morning, the phone rang. It was my mother calling. And she said, Louis, my mother always called me Louis, never Lou. She said, Louis, Dad and I had a miserable night and we didn't sleep. And we've decided that if you and Carol feel you want to go, need to go, we're not going to stand in your way.
Wow.
I had their approval. I called AP. I said, I'm your man. And 2 weeks later, we were in Saigon.
Well, when you went to Vietnam, you also didn't avoid danger. In fact, I'm just looking at a quote from your book. Then and there, I adopted the lesson and lived by it throughout my career. Whatever the threat or danger, I had to be there.
And you write about some horrific scenes that you saw, took part in. Tell us about the rice paddy.
Yeah, this was early on, after maybe 2 months of being in Vietnam. This was the kind of thing that I liked to do more than anything else, was to go out with a small unit of troops. We were a group of 12 Marines and me, and we approached a rice paddy, a dry rice paddy. In other words, the water had been drained out, the rice had been harvested, and it was just this kind of dirt bottom with mud berms around it. And the sergeant who was leading the unit had word that the Viet Cong had been in the area and had seeded the paddy and other areas with mines, landmines. So he instructed each and every one of us individually, step only in the footprint of the man in front of you. And at the very point of this, at the very front of this small column was a Marine with a mine detector, which if nobody has seen one, try to imagine that dentist's mirror that he sticks in your mouth. It looks like a giant version of that, about the size of a kitchen broom, but in the shape of that bent mirror. And he's sweeping this back and forth, and he's getting across, and he finally exits the paddy, and he has not set off a mine. And so we follow. I'm the last man. The sergeant had decided that that was the safest place for a civilian. We're separated, I would guess, by about 10 feet from man to man. And we're somewhere near the middle of the paddy, and the guy in front of me, I hear a very soft click, and then boom. Not a huge explosion, but both of his legs were, well, one foot and a leg from the knee down were blown off right there.
No, God.
And I just I shut down psychologically, mentally. I shut down, and it took a while for my brain to clear a little bit, for the thoughts to come back. But incredibly, I started taking notes right then and there. I didn't run to his side, which I think any normal person would do. I just stood there, stood back, and started taking notes. And two of his other young Marines came running out and picked him up, carried him off.
And he must be screaming, I mean, unimaginably, right?
He was not. He was not screaming.
He was not.
There's not a sound from him.
Wow.
There was not a sound from him. He was in total shock. And they took him off to the side and propped him up against a banana tree on the edge of the paddy. They jabbed a morphine syringe into his thigh, one of his thighs, and tied off the bloody limbs. And I stood there taking notes. And the Marines, the guys who had rescued him and who were with him, his colleagues, his friends, his buddies, they couldn't bear to look at him. So they were looking everywhere but at him, and I was looking only at him. And he died. He died before the helicopter got there.
And I wonder how that lasts in your memory. Obviously, it lasted in your memory, but how it lasts in your emotion, and whether you turn your emotions off at the time, at the moment when you're working, and then whether they come back or they kind of overwhelm you later. Did you have that experience then or on other occasions?
Yeah, I did for the most part. I was able to turn off my emotions while I was covering the war. This was contrary to everything I expected, because I had already myself served in the Marine Corps Reserve. I'd had my active duty training, and I anticipated what to expect. And it turned out that I somehow was able to just shut things off and just be there as a pair of eyes and ears and watch and take notes and write stories without it affecting me in any negative way. And I realized at the time that this was just something that happened to me for reasons I am still 50 years later unable to explain, whereas other journalists, other soldiers were so terribly affected that they've never really come back. I know several journalists, I expect you do know a couple yourself, who have never really gotten past Vietnam. Some of them very seriously injured psychologically. I can't explain it.
And you describe another terrifying kind of incident where, again, you sound totally emotionally detached. You're just focused on doing your job. And this time, you're holed up with Green Berets in an old hunting lodge. North Vietnamese troops are barraging you with bullets and mortar shells. The Green Berets are madly burning all their secret documents.
And I thought, oh boy, if they're burning their records, this is a bad thing.
And the commander comes up to you
And the captain of the Green Berets said, "We're under attack. You're welcome to a rifle." And he handed me an M16. And that was a moment of truth for me.
We are talking with Louis Simons. His memoir is called To Tell the Truth. It's about his life as a foreign correspondent for, 50 years? 60 years?
Yeah.
So, Lou, you raised this question about a reporter, and photographers, of course, go through this all the time, of being the observer or the participant, maybe at times. Now, you did not carry a weapon, did you?
No. I knew how to use an M16. I had been trained on an M14 at Paris Island. The M16 was just a small step up, so that would not be a problem. There were a handful of correspondents who carried weapons at the time. Some of them had M16 rifles. Some of them had large caliber handguns. But that was a moment where I had to say to myself, "Why am I here? Am I here to be a reporter and write this story, or am I here as a participant and to defend myself and these fellow Americans?" Not an easy decision for me. I thought it over and I said, "No, I can't do that. I won't do that."
But one thing you're skipping over is that all this time, this old hunting lodge you're talking about is being riddled with gunfire.
Yeah, right.
From the North Vietnamese troops, the Viet Cong. You're lying on the floor. The enemy, quote unquote, troops are trying to break the perimeter and overrun you. And you're lying there without a gun, taking notes and trying to call in your story, right?
Yeah. As silly as it sounds, that's exactly what was going on. Yeah. The scene is this. So here's this very large structure made of thick teak logs. It had a porch running around it. And beyond the porch was this soccer field. And on the far side of the soccer field was a unit of North Vietnamese. And they were firing mainly small arms, Kalashnikov rifles, but rockets as well. We stayed under fire all through the night. Thank you for bringing this up. This was the key. So I managed to get hold of the captain's field telephone, and I called in a story to the AP Bureau about what was going on.
While you're under attack.
While we're under attack, yeah. And I dictate this. I hadn't been able to write it out, so I'm dictating from my notes. And the fellow at the other end is taking it down on a typewriter. He says, "Well, this is a good story. Keep in touch."
It turned out to be a huge story because this was the beginning of the infamous Tet Offensive. For our listeners who don't know the history, the Tet Offensive was the moment when many U.S. officials finally realized, oh my God, no matter how much we bomb them, no matter how many soldiers we keep sending, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong keep fighting back.
Exactly.
They're even stronger and more resilient than we thought.
NBC News presents Viet Cong Terror.
The new communist campaign in Vietnam continues. It all amounts to the most ambitious series of communist attacks yet mounted, spreading violence into at least 10 provincial capitals, plus American air bases and civilian installations stretching the entire length of the country. None had greater psychological impact than the assault on the American embassy in Saigon.
But, actually, it's interesting. It turned the tide in terms of American perceptions because I think most Americans were under the impression that we were making progress in the war. But North Vietnamese officials later said that they failed in their military objectives. They did not take the areas and hold them that they had planned to.
That is true. Yeah.
So there was a disconnect between American perceptions and realities on the ground in that respect as well.
Well, American reporters were under huge pressure to report mainly good news about the war. You weren't supposed to report the bad news.
And so the AP management were continually getting so-called rockets saying, "Hey, get on the team. You're Americans, your guys are Americans, and you're giving us all this terrible news. Get on the team." You heard that continually.
And how about you, Lou? Because you said when you first arrived, you were gung-ho, you thought the war was a good cause. Did you evolve? Did you change your views as you spent time in the country?
Yeah, very quickly, which is something I did not anticipate. I was genuinely on the team when I went out there. I knew better than to express that in my own words, in my copy, but I anticipated fully that I would be writing about our victorious troops, and it would be a good news story from the American point of view. And then, in very short order, this is what happened. Like just about every correspondent in Saigon in those days, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon every day, we would walk into a building which happened to be across the street from the AP bureau to attend the 5 o'clock Follies.
Yeah.
The 5 o'clock Follies was a derisive name that the reporters gave to this briefing that the military put on every day for an hour or so. This was the good news story that they wanted us to relay back home.
General Westmoreland says the Americans are responding with the greatest concentration of conventional firepower in history. The U.S. artillery fire is 10 times greater than the enemy's.
It concentrated on body count. So inevitably, on any given day, the enemy body count was up. The friendly body count, which meant us and our South Vietnamese allies, was down.
The South Vietnamese lost 216 killed. Enemy dead numbered 1,827. Second highest weekly figure this year.
That was the essence of the briefing.
Probably a lesson for how to read current reporting from Ukraine, eh?
Maybe so. Maybe you know that part of the world and I don't, but that may very well be.
Well, I think those body count numbers are suspect, whether they come from any side.
Yeah. So anyway, like every good reporter, I did this. This had to be done, and each day, one person in the AP bureau would take turns writing the story based on the 5 o'clock Follies. Well, within 2 weeks of my arriving in country, I was out in the field, and I would cover a battle, and then get back to Saigon and hear the briefing on it, and one had nothing to do with the other. And I realized that what was happening here is that they were twisting the story. They were giving us the good news version and leaving out the truth. So unfortunately, I say unfortunately because I felt badly about it at the time, having bought into the war. I realized that it was not what I had imagined. And I turned around pretty quickly.
So how did that get into your copy, actually? How your skepticism or your realization that there were two realities, so to speak, get into your copy? How did you handle that when you had to report straight news?
Oh, I don't think it really did, to be perfectly honest. Listen, the commentary, the interpretation, the analyses, I left to other people, and I just did the straight reporting. And I think it was pretty straight.
And some of that reporting you filed was from an epic battle in the ancient city of Hue. Now, once again, we've talked about this before, you were doing everything you could to rush into the fighting.
The street was directly in the line of fire of one of the strongest NVA positions, the Dong Ba Tower. This imposing structure on the citadel's east wall gave the enemy a great vantage point from which to fire on the Marines as they tried to cross that line.
In fact, as you're racing into town, hundreds of Vietnamese are flooding past you in the opposite direction because they're trying to escape the terrible battles inside Hue. Mm-hmm. And as you write about this in your book, you end up crawling across the dirt on your hands and knees. Yeah. You're scrambling across the dirt because there's a North Vietnamese sniper trying to kill you.
Me.
Nothing personal, I'm sure.
It was the first time in my life where somebody was really firing a gun in anger at me. I had arrived in Hue. This was, again, the first few days of the Tet Offensive. If people who are listening can imagine the forbidden city of China in Beijing, Hue was a smaller version, with those fanciful turrets and towers and tile roofs and so on, and canals. The whole thing is walled in and gated. So the North Vietnamese had been infiltrating it. They had thousands, tens of thousands of troops in place, hidden away in and around the city. And this for the Marine Corps and for the U.S. command was a shocking moment. They realized that they had been training their troops for jungle warfare, totally ignoring the possibility of urban warfare. And that's what Hue was. It was house to house, building to building, sometimes at bayonet length, hand to hand, real stuff.
So there you are in the dirt. Tell us about that.
Okay, so I get to the the gate, the main gate of the city. There's a dirt road going right up into the gateway, and I decided things you think of in moments like this. I decided that I needed to be not on my side of this narrow road, but on the other side, like the chicken. Why do I have to get to the other side? Can't remember, but I felt I had to. And then I was going to crawl up. There was kind of a trench that ran along that side of the road. I was going to crawl up that canal. So I start going across the road, and suddenly a machine gun opens up on me.
Laugh now.
I was absolutely outraged. So I dropped down on my face and crawled on my elbows and knees and fell into the ditch on the other side. This was probably the most terrifying moment I had in Vietnam, maybe in my life. I'm not sure. And I was screaming at him in the few Vietnamese words that I know. Bao chi, bao chi. I'm a reporter.
Bao chi, press. Yeah, we all learned those words.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm after maybe 20 minutes of this, I'm just pouring sweat. A convoy of Marine Corps trucks approaches with troops, and I go running after one. They haul me aboard, and that's how I got into the city.
You know what, though? You write in the book that your main emotion at that moment, as this guy is trying to kill you, was not fear. You said you were furious.
Yeah, I was furious.
Really?
Yeah, really. It was crazy because, in my mind, I'm a journalist. I purposefully don't have a weapon. If I could have gained access to the North Vietnamese or the guerrilla forces, I would have, and I would have reported on them.
You would have interviewed the guy shooting at you.
I would have interviewed.
Why were you trying to kill me? How did it feel?
It was terrifying. Why are they shooting at me, for God's sake? I'm not here to do them any harm. I'm here to report the story.
Well, it's a good illustration of something that a lot of people who denounce the press forget, which is reporters and photographers risk their lives to tell the public what's going on.
Yes, they do.
But you also wrote something else in your memoir, To Tell the Truth, which really struck me. And I'll quote you again here. You said, "Only years after I left Vietnam did I realize that I had learned almost nothing about the people and the country for whom my fellow Americans were fighting and dying."
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that?
It shocked me.
Yeah, I was there for AP to cover Americans for American readership. If I were covering Vietnamese soldiers, there would be only limited interest back home. These are funny little brown people. We're not, we don't speak the same language.
And of course, you're saying that in quotes. These are funny little brown people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
this was a stereotype, and a lot of American soldiers also had those negative stereotypes.
Absolutely.
They had terrible epithets to describe Vietnamese.
Absolutely. So there was no question, neither in my mind nor in the mind of the AP management, that the essential purpose of having reporters and photographers on the ground was to cover the Americans. I never gave a moment's thought to learning a word of Vietnamese beyond Bao Chi and Bami Ba, which was the local beer. Carol and I had no Vietnamese friends. We did not, all our socializing was with other Americans.
But Lou, I can imagine some listeners thinking, but how could you possibly have covered the war accurately, and in depth?
Couldn't. There's no. I wouldn't spend a minute defending myself or defending any of us. I would not for coverage. I mean, it's fascinating to me to read and watch coverage of the war between Ukraine and Russia right now, because it's all about other people. There's virtually no Americans on the ground. This generation of correspondents, for the first time in my mind, are covering a war that does not involve Americans, and I think are being certainly not wholly accurate because there's no access really to the Russian forces. and we are biased toward the Ukrainians, but Americans are out of the picture. As I said before, in this case, in Vietnam, it was all about the Americans.
Just before we leave Vietnam, I just want to make sure I understand this. So that powerful quote that Dave read of yours, that you realized when you left you'd learned nothing about the people in the country, that's something you lament.
Oh, I do. I certainly do. And I did more at the time. Actually, this is a perfect opportunity to segue to the next steps in my reporting in my career. I realized I knew nothing of the country of Vietnam. I didn't cover its politics, I didn't cover its economy, and I didn't cover its culture and society. And AP decided to send me not too far away in Southeast Asia to Malaysia. And I was determined from that moment on to reverse what we've just talked about. And I focused to the fullest extent possible on covering the local people.
And let's pause here in our conversation with Lou Simons.
In our next episode, Lou will tell us how his reporting on local society and politics helped topple a corrupt dictator in the Philippines and also got him kicked out of India.
And we'll hear more about the horrific violence that Lou saw up close and wrote about. And he'll tell us how it's affected him. But for now, that's Two Reporters.
We hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'll repeat that, tworeporters.org or tworeporters.net. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.